The Moghul by Thomas Hoover, Chapter 4. Pinnace is afloat, Cap. I'm thinking we should stow the goods and be underway, if we're going. Macintosh's silhouette was framed in the doorway of the great cabin, his eyes gaunt in the lantern light. Dark had dropped suddenly over the Discovery, bringing with it a cooling respite from the inferno of day. We'll cast off before the watch is out. Start loading the cloth and ironwork, Hawksworth turned, and pointed toward his own locked sea chest, and send for the purser. Macintosh backed through the doorway and turned automatically to leave. But then he paused, his body suspended in uncertainty for a long moment. Finally, he revolved again to Hawksworth. Have to tell you, I've a feelin' we'll na be sailin' out o' this piss hole alive. He squinted across the semi-dark of the cabin. It's my nose tellin' me, sir, and she's always right. The company's sailed to the Indies twice before, Macintosh. Aye, but na to India. The bleedin' company ne'er dropped anchor in this nest o' Portugals. 'Twas down to Java before, with nothin' but a few Dutchmen to trouble o'er. India's na the Indies, Cap. The Indies is down in the Spice Islands, where seas are open. The ports o' India belong to the Portugals, sure as England owns the Straits o' Dover. So beggin' your pardon, Cap, this is na the Indies. This might well be Lisbon Harbor. We'll have a secure anchorage, and once we're inland, the Portugals can't touch us. Hawksworth tried to hold a tone of confidence in his voice. The pilot says he can take us upriver tonight, under cover of dark. No Christian can trust a bleedin' Moor, Cap'n. And this one's got a curious look, somethin' in his eyes. Can't tell if he's lookin' at you or nah. Hawksworth wanted to agree, but he stopped himself. Moors just have their own ways, Macintosh. Their mind works differently, but I can already tell this one's not like the Turks. Hawksworth still had not decided what he thought about the pilot. It scarcely matters now, he told himself. We've no choice but to trust him. Whatever he's thinking, he'll have no room to play us false. Maybe nah, but he keeps looking toward the shore. Like. He's expectin' something. The bastard's not tellin' us what he knows. I smell it. The nose, Cap'n. We'll have muskets, Macintosh, and the cover of dark. Now load the pinnace and let's be on with it. Macintosh stared at the boards, shifting and tightening his belt. He started to argue more, but Hawksworth's voice stopped him. And Macintosh, order the muskets primed with pistol shot. Hawksworth recalled a trick his father had once told him about, many long years past. If anybody ventures to surprise us, we'll hand them a surprise in turn. A musket ball's useless in the dark of night. Clump of pistol shot at close quarters is another story. The prospect of a fight seemed to transform Macintosh. With a grin, he snapped alert, whirled, and stalked down the companionway toward the main deck. Moments later, the balding purser appeared, a lifelong seaman with an unctuous smile and rapacious eyes, who had dispensed stores on many a prosperous merchantman, and grown rich on a career of bribes. He mechanically logged Hawksworth's chest in his account book, and then signaled the boatswain to stow the heavy wooden trunk into the pinnace. Hawksworth watched the proceedings absently as he checked the edge on his sword. Then he slipped the belt over his shoulder and secured its large brass buckle. Finally, he locked the stern windows and surveyed the darkened cabin one last time. The Discovery, may God defend her and see us all home safe, every man. Then, without looking back, he firmly closed the heavy oak door, latched it, and headed down the companionway toward the main deck. Rolls of broadcloth lay stacked along the waist of the ship, and beside them were muskets and a keg of powder. George Elkington was checking off samples of cloth as they were loaded erdo the pinnace, noting his selection in a book of accounts. Standing next to him, watching idly, was Humphrey Spencer, youngest son of Sir Randolph Spencer. He had shipped the voyage as the assistant to Elkington, but his real motivation was not commerce but adventure, and a stock of tales to spin out in taverns when he returned. His face of 20 had suffered little from the voyage, for a stream of bribes to the knowing purser had reserved for him the choice provisions, including virtually all the honey and raisins. Humphrey Spencer had donned a tall, brimmed hat, a feather protruding from its beaver band, and his fresh doublet of green taffeta fairly glowed in the lantern's rays. His new thigh-length hose were an immaculate tan, and his rough collar pure silk. A bouquet of perfume hovered about him like an invisible cloud. Spencer turned and began to pace the deck in distraught agitation, oblivious to his interference, as weary seamen worked around him to drag rolls of broadcloth next to the gunwales, stacking them for others to hoist and stow in the pinnace. Then he spotted Hawkesworth, and his eyes brightened. "Captain, at last you're here. Your boatswain is an arrant knave, my life on't. He'll not of these rogues stow my chest." "There's no room in the pinnace for your chest, Spencer. But how am I to conduct affairs mongst the moors without a gentleman's fittings?" He reviewed Hawkesworth's leather jerkin and sea boots with disdain. Before Hawkesworth could reply, Elkington was pulling himself erect, wincing at the gout as his eyes blazed. "Spencer, you've enough to do just mindin' the accounts, which thus far you've shown scant aptness for." He turned and spat into the scuppers. "Your father'd have me make you a merchant, but methinks I'd sooner school an ape to sing. 'Tis traddin' we're here for, not to preen like a damned coxcomb. Now look to it. You'll accompany us, Spencer, as is your charge." Hawkesworth walked past the young clerk, headed for the forecastle. "The only fittings you'll need are a sword and musket, which I dearly hope you know enough to use. Now prepare to board." As Hawkesworth passed the mainmast, boatswain's mate John Garway dropped the bundle he was holding and stepped forward, beaming a toothless smile. "Beggin' your pardon, Captain, might I be having a word?" "What is it, Garway?" "Would you ask the heathen, sir, for the men? We've been wonderin' if there's like to be an alehouse or such in this place we're goin'. And a few o' the kindly sex what might be friendly disposed, if you follow my reckonin', sir." Hawkesworth looked up and saw Karim waiting by the forecastle, his effects rolled in a small woven tapestry under his arm. When the question was translated, the pilot laid aside the bundle and stepped toward the group of waiting seamen, who had all stopped work to listen. He studied them for a moment, ragged and rank with sweat, their faces blotched with scurvy, and their hair matted with grease and lice, and smiled with expressionless eyes. "Your men will find they can purchase arrack, a local liquor as potent as any I have seen from Europe. And the public women of Surat are masters of all refinements of the senses. They are exquisite, worthy even of the Moghul himself. Accomplished women of pleasure have been brought here from all civilized parts of the world, even Egypt and Persia. I'm sure your seamen will find the accommodations of Surat worthy of their expectations." Hawkesworth translated the reply, and a cheer rose from the men. "Hear that, mates?" Master's mate Thomas Davies turned to the crowd, his face a haggard leer. "Let the rotten Portugals swab cannon in hell. I'll be a swim in grog and snuffin' my wick with a willin' wench. Heathen or no, 'tis all one what say." A confirming hurrah lifted from the decks, and the men resumed their labor, with spirits noticeably replenished. Hawkesworth turned and ascended the companionway ladder to the quarterdeck, leaving behind the tense bravado. As he surveyed the deck below from his new vantage, he suddenly sensed an eerie light enveloping the ship, a curious glow that seemed almost to heighten the pensive lament of the boards and the lulling melody of wind through the rigging. Then he realized why. The moon. I'd forgotten, or was I too tired to think? But now it's almost like daylight. God help us, we've lost the last of our luck. Ready to cast off. Mackintosh mounted the companionway to the quarterdeck, his face now drawn deep with fatigue. "Shall I board the men?" Hawksworth turned with a nod and followed him down to the main deck. Oarsmen began scrambling down the side of the Discovery, a motley host, shoeless and clad only in powder-smudged breeches. Though a rope ladder dangled from the gunwales, the seamen preferred to grasp the dead eyes, easing themselves onto the raised gunport lids, and from there dropping the last few feet into the pinnace. They were followed by George Elkington, who lowered himself down the swaying ladder. Breathing oaths, Hawksworth lingered by the railing, searching the moonlit horizon and the darkened coast. His senses quickened as he probed for some clue that would trigger an advance alert. But the moonlit water's edge lay barren, deserted save for an occasional beached fishing skiff, its sisal nets exposed on poles to dry. Why the emptiness? During the day there were people. Then he sensed Karim standing beside him, also intent on the empty shore. The pilot's back was to the lantern that swung from the mainmast, and his face was shrouded in shadow. Abruptly, he addressed Hawksworth in Turkey. "The face of India glories in the moonlight, do you agree? It is beautiful and lies at peace." "You're right about the beauty. It could almost be the coast of Wales." Hawksworth thought he sensed a powerful presence about Karim now, something he could not explain, only detect with a troubled intuition. Then the pilot spoke again. "Have you prepared yourself to meet the Shahbandar?" "We're ready. We have samples of English goods, and I'm an ambassador from King James. There's no reason to deny us entry. I told you he is a man of importance, and he already knows, as all who matter will soon know, of your exceptional fortune today. Do you really think today's battle will go unnoticed in India? I think the Portugals noticed, and I know they'll be back, but with luck, we'll manage." Hawksworth felt the muscles in his throat tighten involuntarily, knowing a fleet of warships from Goa would probably be headed north within a fortnight. "No, Captain, again you miss my meaning." Karim turned to draw closer to Hawksworth, flashing a joyless smile. "I speak of India, not the Portuguese. They are nothing. Yes, they trouble our seas, but they are nothing. They do not rule India. Do you understand?" Hawksworth stiffened, unsure how to respond. "I know the Moghul rules India, and that he'll have to wonder if the damned Portugals are still master of his seas. Surely you realize, Captain, that the Portuguese's profits are staggering. Are you also aware these profits are shared with certain persons of importance in India?" "You mean the Portugals have bribed officials?" "That's nothing new," Hawksworth thought. "Who? The Shahbandar. Let us say they often give commissions." Karim waved his hand, as though administering a dispensation. "But there are others whom they allow to invest directly in their trade. The profits give these persons power they often do not use wisely. Are you telling me the Moghul himself invests with the damned Portugals?" Hawksworth's hopes plummeted. "On the contrary, His Majesty is an honorable man, and a simple man who knows but little of what some do in his name. But do you understand, there must be one in his realm who will someday have his place. Remember, he is mortal. He rules like a god, but he is mortal. What does this have to do with the Shahbandar? Surely he'd not challenge the Moghul, and I know the Moghul has sons. Of course, he is not the one." Karim's smile was gentle. "But do not forget the Shahbandar is powerful, more powerful than most realize. He knows all that happens in India, for his many friends repay their obligation to him with knowledge. As for you, if he judges your wisdom worthy of your fortune today, he may choose to aid you. Your journey to Agra will not be without peril. There are already those in India who will not wish you there. Perhaps the Shahbandar can give you guidance. It will be for him to decide." Hawksworth studied Karim incredulously. How could he know? Whatever I may find necessary to do, it will not involve a port official like the Shabandar, and a trip to Agra surely would not require his approval. But you must find your way. Karim examined Hawksworth with a quick sidelong glance, realizing he had guessed correctly. My friend, your defeat of the Portuguese today may have implications you do not realize, but at times you talk as a fool, even more than the Portuguese. You will need a guide on your journey. Believe me when I tell you. Karim paused for a moment to examine Hawksworth, as though wondering how to couch his next words. Perhaps you should let the stars guide you. In the Holy Quran, the Prophet has said of Allah, and he hath set for you the stars, that you may guide your course by them. Hawksworth picked up the verse, amid the dark of land and sea. Yes, I learned that verse in Tunis, and I knew already a seaman steers by the stars, but I don't understand what bearing that has on a journey to Agra. Just as I begin to think you have wisdom, again you cease to listen. But I think now you will remember what I have said. Hawksworth, Elkington's voice boomed from the pinnace below. Have we sailed a blessed 7 months to this nest, O heathens so's to idle about and palaver? Hawksworth turned to see Humphrey Spencer, gingerly lowering himself down the ladder into the pinnace, the feather in his hatband whipping in the night wind. The oarsmen were at their stations, ready. One thing more, Captain. Karim pressed a hand against Hawksworth's arm, holding him back. One thing more I will tell you. Many Feringhi, foreigners who come to India, are very unwise. Because our women keep the veil and dwell indoors, foreigners assume they have no power, no influence. Do not act as other foolish Feringhi and make this mistake. In Surat. What women do you mean? The wives of officials. Please listen. When you reach Surat, remember one last admonition from the Quran. There it is written, as for women from whom you fear rebellion, admonish them and banish them to beds apart. But sometimes a woman too can be strong-willed. She can be the one who banishes her husband, denying him his rights. If she is important, there is nothing he can do. Remember. Damn it to hell, Elkington's voice roared again. I'm not lickin' these moonlight ventures. 'Tis full risk aplenty when you can see who's holdin' a knife to your throat. But if we're goin', I say let's be done with it and have off. Hawksworth turned back to Karim, but he was gone, swinging himself lightly over the side of the Discovery and into the pinnace. Across the moonlight-drenched swells, the Resolve lay quiet, her stern lantern reassuringly aglow, ready to hoist sail for the cove. And on the Discovery, seamen were at station, poised to follow. Hawksworth looked once more toward the abandoned shore, troubled, and then dropped quickly down the side into the pinnace. There was no sound now. Only the cadence of the boards as the Discovery's anchor chain argued against the tide. And then a dull thud as the mooring line dropped onto the floor planking of the pinnace. Hawksworth ordered Mackintosh to row with the tide until they reached the shelter of the river mouth, and then to ship the oars and hoist sail if the breeze held. He had picked the ablest men as oarsmen, those not wounded and least touched by scurvy, and next to each lay a heavy cutlass. He watched Mackintosh in admiration as the quartermaster effortlessly maneuvered the tiller with one hand and directed the oarsmen with the other. The moon was even more alive now, glinting off the Scotsman's red hair. As the hypnotic rhythm of the oars lulled Hawksworth's mind, he felt a growing tiredness begin to beg at his senses. Against his will, he started to drift, to follow the moonlight's dancing, prismatic tinge on the moving crest of waves, and to puzzle over what lay ahead. Half dozing, he found his thoughts drawn to the Shabandar who waited in Surat, almost like a gatekeeper who held the keys to India. He mulled Karim's words again, the hints of what would unlock that doorway, and slowly his waking mind drifted out of reach. He passed unknowing into that dreamlike state where deepest truth so often lies waiting, unknown to rationality. And there, somehow, the pilot's words made perfect sense. Permission to hoist the sail. Mackintosh cut the pinnace into the river mouth, holding to the center of the channel. Hawksworth startled momentarily at the voice, then forced himself alert and scanned the dark riverbanks. There was still nothing. He nodded to Mackintosh and watched as the sail slipped quietly up the mast. Soon the wind and tide were carrying them swiftly, silently. As he watched the run of the tide against the hull, he suddenly noticed a group of round objects, deep red, bobbing past. Karim, Hawksworth drew his sword and pointed toward one of the balls. What are those? A fruit of our country, Captain. The Topiwalas call them coconuts. Karim's voice was scarcely above a whisper, and his eyes left the shore for only a moment. They are the last remains of the August festival. What festival is that? The celebration of the Hindu traders, marking the end of the monsoon and the opening of the Tapti River to trade. Hindus at Surat smear coconuts with vermilion and cast them into the Tapti, believing this will appease the angry life force of the sea. They also cover barges with flowers and span them across the harbor. If you were there, you would hear them play their music and chant songs to their heathen gods. And the coconuts eventually float out to sea. A few, yes, but mostly they are stolen by wicked boys who swim after them. These few perhaps their gods saved for themselves. Hawksworth examined the bobbing balls anew. The coconut was yet another legend of the Indies. Stories passed that a man could live for days on the liquor sealed within its straw-matted shell. The moon chased random clouds, but still the riverbank was illuminated like day. The damp air was still, amplifying the music of the night, the buzz of gnats, the call of night birds, even the occasional trumpet of a distant elephant pierced the solid wood line on either side of the narrowing river. Hawksworth tasted the dark, alert, troubled. Where are the human sounds? Where are the barges I saw plying the river mouth during the day? I sense an uneasiness in the pilot, an alarm he does not wish me to see. Damn the moon, if only we had dark. Karim, Hawksworth spoke softly. His eyes never longed from the dense rampart of trees along the riverbank. What do you wish, Captain? Have you ever traveled up the river before by moonlight? Once, yes, many years ago, when I was young and burning for a woman after our ship had dropped anchor in the bay. I was only a Karwa then, a common seaman, and I thought I would not be missed. I was wrong. The Nakuta discovered me in Surat and reclaimed my wage for the entire voyage. It was a very hungry time. Was the river quiet then, as it is now? Yes, Captain, just the same. Though Karim looked at him directly, the darkness still guarded his eyes. Mackintosh, Hawksworth's voice cut the silence. Issue the muskets. His eyes swept along the shore, and then to the narrow bend they were fast approaching. Karim is lying, he told himself. At last the pilot has begun to play false with us. Why? What does he fear? Aye, aye, Captain. Mackintosh was instantly alert. What do you see? The sudden voices startled Elkington awake, and his nodding head snapped erect. The damned Moors have settled in for the night. If you'd hold your peace, I could join 'em. I'll need the full o' my wits for haggling with that subtle lot o' thieves come the morrow. There's no Portugals, and the night birds are quiet as mice. Precisely, Hawksworth shot back. And I would thank you to take a musket, and note its flintlock is full cocked and the flashband dry. Then he continued, Mackintosh, strike the sail, and Karim, take the tiller. The pinnace was a sudden burst of activity, as seamen quickly hauled in the sail and began to check the prime on their flintlocks. With the sail lashed, their view was unobstructed in all directions. The tide rushing through the narrows of the approaching bend carried the pinnace ever more rapidly, and now only occasional help was needed from the oarsmen to keep it aright. A cloud drifted over the moon, and for an instant the river turned black. Hawksworth searched the darkness ahead, silent, waiting. Then he saw it. On the boards, a blaze of musket fire spanned the river ahead, illuminating the blockade of longboats. Balls sang into the water around them, while others splattered off the side of the pinnace, or hissed past the mast. Then the returning moon glinted off the silver helmets of the Portuguese infantry. As Karim instinctively cut the pinnace toward the shore, Portuguese longboats maneuvered easily toward them, muskets spewing sporadic flame. The English oarsmen positioned themselves to return the fire, but Hawksworth stopped them. Not yet, he told himself, we'll have no chance to reload. The first round has to count, and damn my thoughtlessness for not bringing pikes. We could have. The pinnace lurched crazily and careened sideways, hurtling around broadside to the longboats. A sandbar? We've struck a damned sandbar, but we've got to face them with the prow. Otherwise, as though sensing Hawksworth's thoughts, Karim seized an oar and began to pull the pinnace's stern off the bar. Slowly it eased around, coming about to face the approaching longboats. No sooner had the pinnace righted itself than the first longboat glanced off the side of the bow, and a grapple caught their gunwale. Then the first Portuguese soldier leaped aboard and doubled in a flame of sparks as Mackintosh shoved a musket into his belly and pulled the trigger. As the other English muskets spoke out in a spray of pistol shot, several Portuguese in the longboat pitched forward, writhing. Mackintosh began to bark commands for reloading. Half-cock your muskets, wipe your pans, handle your primers, cast about to charge. But time had run out. 2 more longboats bracketed each side of the bow, and now Portuguese were piling aboard. Damn the muskets, Hawksworth yelled. Take your swords. The night air came alive with the sound of steel against steel, while each side taunted the other with unintelligible obscenities. The English were outnumbered many to 1, and slowly they found themselves being driven to the stern of the pinnace. Still more Portuguese poured aboard now, as the pinnace groaned against the sand. Hawksworth kept to the front of his men, matching the poorly trained Portuguese infantry easily. Thank God there's no more footroom, he thought. We can almost stand them man for man. At that moment, 2 Portuguese pinned Hawksworth's sword against the mast, allowing a third to gain footing and lunge. As Hawksworth swerved to avoid the thrust, his foot crashed through the thin planking covering the keel, bringing him down. Mackintosh yelled a warning and leaped forward, slashing the first soldier through the waist and sending him to the bottom of the pinnace. Moaning, then the quartermaster seized the other man by the throat and, lunging like a bull, whipped him against the mast, snapping his neck. Hawksworth groped blindly for his sword and watched as the third soldier poised for a mortal sweep. Where is it? Good God, he'll cut me in half. Suddenly he felt a cold metal object pressed against his hand, and above the din, he caught Humphrey Spencer's high-pitched voice, urging. It was a pocket pistol. Did he prime it? Does he know how? As the Portuguese soldier began his swing, Hawksworth raised the pistol and squeezed. There was a dull snap, a hiss, and then a blaze that melted the soldier's face into red. He flung the pistol aside and seized the dying Portuguese's sword. He was armed again, but there was little advantage left. Slowly, the English were crowded into a huddle of the stern. Cornered, abaft the mast, they no longer had room to parry. Hawksworth watched in horror as a burly Portuguese, his silver helmet askew, braced himself against the mast and drew back his sword to send a swath through the English. Hawksworth tried to set a parry, but his arms were pinned. He'll kill half the men. The bastard will. A bemused expression unexpectedly illuminated the soldier's face, a smile with no mirth. In an instant, it transmuted to disbelief. while his raised sword clattered to the planking. As Hawksworth watched, the Portuguese's hand began to work mechanically at his chest. Then his helmet tumbled away, and he slumped forward, motionless but still erect. He stood limp, head cocked sideways, as though distracted during prayer. Why doesn't he move? Was this all some bizarre, senseless jest? Then Hawksworth saw the arrows. A neat row of thin bamboo shafts had pierced the soldier's Portuguese armor, riveting him to the mast. A low-pitched hum swallowed the sudden silence, as volleys of bamboo arrows sang from the darkness of the shore. Measured, deadly. Hawksworth watched in disbelief, as one by one the Portuguese soldiers around them crumpled, a few firing wildly into the night. In what seemed only moments it was over, the air a cacophony of screams and moaning death. Hawksworth turned to Karim, noting fright in the pilot's eyes for the very first time. The arrows, he finally found his voice. Whose are they? I can probably tell you. The pilot stepped forward and deftly broke away the feathered tip on one of the shafts, still holding the Portuguese to the mast. As he did so, the other arrows snapped, and the Portuguese slumped against the gunwale, then slipped over the side and into the dark water. Karim watched him disappear, then raised the arrow to the moonlight. For an instant, Hawksworth thought he saw a quizzical look enter the pilot's eyes. Before he could speak, lines of fire shot across the surface of the water, as fire arrows came, slamming into the longboats as they drifted away on the tide. Streak after streak found the hulls, and in moments they were torches. In the flickering light, Hawksworth could make out what seemed to be grapples, flashing from the shore, pulling the floating bodies of the dead and dying to anonymity. He watched spellbound for a moment, then turned again toward the stern. Karim, I asked whose arrows. The pilot was gone. Only the English seamen remained, dazed and uncomprehending. Then the night fell suddenly silent once more, save for the slap of the running tide against the hull. The Moghul by Thomas Hoover, Chapter 5. The room was musty and close, as though the rainy season had not passed, and the floor was hard mud. Through crude wooden shutters, they could glimpse the early sun stoking anew for the day's inferno. But now, it merely washed the earthen walls in stripes of golden light. Hawksworth stood by the window, examining the grassy square that spanned out toward the river. The porters, in whose lodge they were confined, milled about the open area, chanting and sweating as they unloaded large bales of cotton from the two-wheeled bullock carts that continually rolled into the square. He steadied himself against the heavy wooden frame of the window and wondered if his land legs would return before the day was out. God curse all Moors. Mackintosh stooped over the tray resting on the grease-smudged center carpet and pulled a lid from one of the earthen bowls. He stared critically at the dense, milky liquid inside, then gingerly dipped in a finger and took a portion to his lips. He tested the substance tangy curds smelling faintly of spice, and his face hardened. 'Tis damned spoilt milk. He spat fiercely onto the carpet and seized a piece of fried bread to purge the taste. Fitter for swine than men. What they do with the samples? Elkington sprawled heavily in the corner, his eyes bloodshot from the all-night vigil upriver. With no guards, the heathens'll be thievin' the lot. He squinted toward the window, but made no effort to move. His exhaustion and despair were total. The goods are still where they unloaded them. Hawksworth revolved toward the room. They say nothing happens till the Shahbandar arrives. What they say about him? Elkington slowly drew himself to his feet. They said he arrives at mid-morning, verifies his seal on the customs house door, and then orders it opened. They also said that all traders must be searched personally by his officers. He imposes duty on everything, right down to the shillings in your pocket. Damned if I'll pay duty, not for samples. That's what I said, and they ignored me. It seems to be law. Hawksworth noticed that the gold was dissolving from the dawn sky, surrendering to a brilliant azure. He turned, scooped a portion of curds onto a piece of fried bread, and silently chewed as he puzzled over the morning. And the night before. Who had saved them? And why? Did someone in India hate the Portuguese so much they would defend the English before even knowing who they were? No one in India could know about King James's letter, about the East India Company's plans. No one, even George Elkington, did not know everything. Yet someone in India already wanted the English alive. He had wrestled with the question for the rest of the trip upriver. And he could think of no answers. They had been saved for a reason he did not know, and that worried him even more than the Portuguese. Without a pilot, they had had to probe upriver slowly, sounding for sandbars with an oar. Finally, when they were near exhaustion, the river suddenly curved and widened. Then, in the first dim light of morning, they caught the unmistakable outlines of a harbor. It had to be Surat. The river lay north-south now, with the main city sprawled along its eastern shore. The tide began to fall back, depleted. And he realized they had timed its flow perfectly. As they waited for dawn, the port slowly revealed itself in the eastern glow. Long stone steps emerged directly from the Tapti River and broadened into a wide, airy square, flanked on three sides by massive stone buildings. The structure on the downriver side was obviously a fortress built square with a large turret at each corner. And along the top of walls, Hawksworth could see the muzzles of cannon they looked to be 8-inchers, trained directly on the water. And in the waning dark, he spotted tiny points of light, spaced regularly along the top of the fortress walls. That could only mean one thing. Mackintosh, ship the oars and drop anchor. We can't dock until daylight. Aye, Captain, but why not take her in now? We can see to make a landin'. And they can see us well enough to position their cannon. Look carefully along there. Hawksworth directed his gaze toward the top of the fortress. They've lighted linstocks for the guns. Mother of God, do they think we're going to storm their bleeding harbor with a pinnace? Probably a standard precaution. But if we hold here, at least we'll keep at the edge of their range. And we'd better put all weapons out of sight. I want them to see a pinnace of friendly traders at sunup. The dawn opened quickly, and as they watched, the square blossomed to life. Large two-wheeled carts appeared through the half-dark, drawn by muscular black oxen, some of whose horns had been tipped in silver. One by one, the oxen lumbered into the square, urged forward by the shouts and beatings of turbaned drivers who wore folded white skirts instead of breeches. Small fires were kindled by some of the men, and the unmistakable scent of glowing dung chips savored the dark clouds of smoke that drifted out across the river's surface. Then Hawksworth first noticed the bathers that had appeared along the shore on either side of the stone steps. Brown men stripped to loincloths, and women in brilliantly colored head-to-toe wraps were easing themselves ceremoniously into the chilled, mud-colored water, some bowing repeatedly in the direction of the rising sun. Only the waters fronting the stairway remained unobstructed. When the dawn sky had lightened to a muted red, Hawksworth decided to start their move. He surveyed the men crowded in the pinnace one last time, and read in some faces expectation and in others fear. But in all there was bone-deep fatigue. Only Elkington seemed fully absorbed in the vision that lay before them. Even from their distance, the chief merchant was already assessing the goods being unloaded from the carts. Rolls of brown cloth, bundles of indigo, and bales of combed cotton fiber. He would point, then turn and gesture excitedly as he lectured Spencer. The young clerk was now a bedraggled remnant of fashion in the powder-smudged remains of his new doublet. The plumed hat he had worn as they cast off had been lost in the attack downriver, and now he crouched in the bottom of the pinnace, humiliated and morose, his eyes vacant. Mackintosh weigh anchor, will row to the steps, slowly. The men bobbed alert as they hoisted the chain into the prow of the pinnace. Oars were slipped noisily into their rowlocks, and Mackintosh signaled to get underway. As they approached the stairway, alarmed cries suddenly arose from the sentinels stationed on stone platforms flanking either side of the steps. In moments, a crowd collected along the river, with turbaned men shouting in a language Hawksworth could not place and gesturing the pinnace away from the dock. What could they want? He asked himself. Who are they? They're not armed. They don't look hostile. Just upset. Permission to land. Hawksworth shouted to them in Turkish, his voice slicing through the din and throwing a sudden silence over the crowd. The customs house does not open until 2 hours before midday, a tall, bearded man shouted back. Then he squinted toward the pinnace. Who are you? Portuguese. No, we're English. So that's it, Hawksworth thought. They assumed we were Portugals with a boatload of booty, here for a bit of private trade. The man examined the pinnace in confusion. Then he shouted again over the waters. You are not Portuguese. I told you we're English. Only Portuguese tapiwalas are allowed to trade. The man was now scrutinizing the pinnace in open perplexity. We've no goods for trade, only samples. Hawksworth tried to think of a way to confound the bureaucratic mind. We only want food and drink. You cannot land at this hour. In name of Allah, the Merciful. Hawksworth stretched for his final ploy, invocation of that hospitality underlying all Islamic life. Demands can be ignored. A traveler's need, never. Food and drink for my men. Miraculously, it seemed to work. The bearded man stopped short and examined them again closely. Then he turned and dictated rapidly to the group of waiting porters. In moments, the men had plunged into the chilled morning water, calling for the mooring line of the pinnace. As they towed the pinnace into the shallows near the steps, other porters swarmed about the boat and gestured to indicate the English should climb over the gunwales and be carried ashore. They caught hold of George Elkington first. He clung futilely to the gunwales as he was dragged cursing from the bobbing pinnace and hoisted on the backs of 2 small Indian men. Arms flailing, he toppled himself from their grasp and splashed backward into the muddy tapti. After he floated to the surface, sputtering, he was dragged bodily from the water and up the steps. Then the others were carried ashore, and only Mackintosh tried to protest. The last to leave the pinnace, Hawksworth hoisted himself off the prow and onto the back of a wiry Indian, whose thin limbs belied their strength. The man's turban smelled faintly of sweat, but his well-worn shirt was spotless. His dark eyes assessed Hawksworth with a practiced sidelong glance, evaluating his attire, his importance, and the approximate cash value of his sword in a single sweep. Only after the porters had deposited them on the stone steps did Hawksworth finally realize that India's best port had no wharf, that human backs served as the loading platform for all men and goods. As he looked around, he also noticed they had been surrounded by a crowd of men, not identified by turbans as were the porters, but uniformed more expensively and wielding long, heavy canes. Wordlessly, automatically, the men aligned themselves in 2 rows to create a protected pathway leading up the steps and into the square. Hawksworth watched as they beat back the gathering crowd of onlookers with their canes, and he suddenly understood this was how the port prevented traders from passing valuables to an accomplice in the crowd and circumventing customs. Then the tall, bearded man approached Hawksworth, smiled professionally, and bowed in the manner of Karim, hands together at the brow. "You are welcome in the name of the Shahbandar, as a guest only, not as a trader." Without further greeting, he directed them across the open square toward a small stone building. "You will wait in the porter's lodge until the customs house opens." As he ordered the heavy wooden door opened, he curtly added, "The Shahbandar will rule whether your presence here is permitted." He had watched them enter, and then he was gone. Shortly after, the food had appeared. Hawksworth examined the room once more, its close air still damp with the chill of dawn. The walls were squared, and the ceiling high and arched. In a back corner a niche had been created, and in it rested a small round stone pillar, presumably a religious object, but one Hawksworth did not recognize. Who would venerate a column of stone, he mused, particularly one which seems almost like a man's organ. It can't be the Muslims. They worship their own organs like no other race, but they generally honor their law against icons. So it must be for the Gentiles, the Hindus, which means that the porters are Hindus and their overseers Moors. That's the privilege of conquerors. Just like every other land, the Moors have seized by the sword. He glanced again at the tray and noted that the food had been completely devoured, consumed by ravenous seamen who would have scorned to touch milk curds 6 months before. After a moment's consideration, Hawksworth turned and seated himself on the edge of the carpet. "There's nothing to be done. We may as well rest while we have the chance." George Elkington had rolled himself in a corner of the carpet, and now he dozed fitfully. Humphrey Spencer fought sleep as he worked vainly to brush away the powder smudges from his doublet. Mackintosh had finished whetting his seaman's knife, and now sat absorbed in searching his hair for lice. Bosun's mate John Garway lounged against a side wall, idly scratching his codpiece and dreaming of the women he would soon have, his toothless smile fixed in sleepy anticipation. The master's mate. Thomas Davies dozed in a heap by the door, his narrow face depleted and aged with scurvy. In a back corner, dice and a pile of coins had miraculously appeared, and the other seamen sprawled about them on the floor, bloodshot eyes focused on the chance numbers that would spell the longest splurge in port. Hawksworth stretched his wounded leg once more, leaned stiffly against the front wall, and forced his mind to drift again into needed rest. Hawksworth was suddenly alert, his senses troubled. The sun had reached mid-morning now, and it washed the mud floor in brilliant yellow light. He sensed that a heavy shadow had passed through its beam. He had not specifically seen it, but somehow, intuitively, he knew. Without a word, he edged to the side of the heavy wooden door, his hand close to his sword handle. All the others, except Mackintosh, were by now asleep. Only the quartermaster had noticed it. He quickly moved to the side of the door opposite Hawksworth and casually drew his heavy, bone-handled knife. Without warning, the door swung outward. Facing them was the same bearded man who had invited them ashore. The square behind him was bright now with the glare of late morning, and in the light Hawksworth realized he was wearing an immaculate white turban, a long blue skirt over tightly fitting white breeches, and ornate leather shoes, turned up at the toe in a curved point. This time, however, he no longer bore welcome. "Where have you anchored your ships?" The turkey was accented and abrupt. News travels fast, Hawksworth thought, as he tried to shove the haze from his mind. "Where is the Shahbandar? Your merchantmen were not in the bay this morning. Where are they now?" The man seemed to ignore Hawksworth's question. "I demand to see the Shahbandar, and I'll answer no questions till I do." "You do not demand of the Shahbandar." The man's black beard worked nervously, even when he paused. "You and all your men are to be brought to the customs house, together with your goods." "Where is he now?" "He is here." Where? The Indian turned and gestured quickly across the Maiden, the square, toward the large windowless stone building that sat on the water's edge opposite the fortress. Hawksworth looked at the cluster of armed guards and realized this must be the Mint. This was the building, he now remembered Karim telling him, where foreign money was exchanged. All foreign coins, even Spanish rials of 8, were required to be melted down and reminted into rupees before they could be used for purchase. Supposedly a protection against counterfeit or base coin, this requirement produced months of delay. The Shahbandar gave only one alternative to traders in a hurry: borrow ready-made rupees at exorbitant interest. After he has authorized the beginning of today's work at the Mint, he will verify the seal on the door of the customs house. He pointed to the squat building adjoining their lodge, and open it for today. All goods must be taxed and receive his chap or seal before they can enter or leave India. The men had begun to stir, and Hawksworth turned to translate. The English assembled warily, and the air came alive with an almost palpable apprehension as Hawksworth led them into the bustling square. We must wait. The tall Indian suddenly paused near the center of the Maiden, just as a group of guards emerged from the Mint. Each wore a heavy sword, and they were escorting a large closed palanquin carried on the shoulders of 4 bearers dressed only in white skirts folded about their waist. The guards cleared a path through the crowd of merchants and made their way slowly to the door of the customs house. The crowd surged in behind them, blocking the view, but moments later the tall doors of the customs house were seen to swing open, and the crowd funneled in behind the palanquin and the guards. Then the Indian motioned for them to follow. The interior of the customs house smelled of sweat, mingled with spice, and the dusty fragrance of indigo. As oil lamps were lighted and attached to the side walls, the milling crowd grew visible. Through the semi-dark porters were already bearing the English goods in from the Maiden and piling them in one of the allotted stalls. The tall guide turned to Hawksworth. You and all your men must now be searched, here in the counting room. I'll not allow it. Hawksworth motioned the English back. I told you I demand to see the Shahbandar. He'll receive you when he will. He has not granted an audience. Then will not be searched. Tell him that, now. The Indian paused for a moment, then reluctantly turned and made his way toward a door at the rear of the large room. Elkington pressed forward, his face strained. Tell the bleedin' heathen we're English. We'll not be treated like this rabble. He motioned around the room, a bedlam of Arab, Persian, and Indian traders, who eyed the English warily as they shouted for the attention of customs inspectors and competed to bribe porters. Just hold quiet. I think they know exactly who we are, and they know about the ships. As they waited, Hawksworth wondered what he should tell the Shahbandar, and he again puzzled over the words of Karim. Think, what can you tell him that he hasn't already heard? I'll wager he knows full well we were attacked by Portugals in the bay, that we burned and sank 2 galleons. Will he now hold us responsible for warfare in Indian waters? I'll even wager he knows we were attacked on the river, and who saved us. The large Indian was returning, striding through the center aisle, accompanied by 4 of the Shahbandar's guards. He motioned for Hawksworth to follow, alone. The door of the rear chamber was sheathed in bronze, with heavy ornate hinges and an immense hasp. It seemed to swing open of itself as they approached, and they were in the chamber of the Shahbandar. As he entered, Hawksworth was momentarily blinded by the blaze of oil lamps that lined the walls of the room. Unlike the simple plaster walls and pillars of the outer receiving area, this inner chamber was forbiddingly ornate, with gilded ceilings almost 30 feet high. The room was already bustling with clerks straightening piles of account books and readying themselves for the day's affairs. The room fell silent, and a way suddenly cleared through the center as the Hindu clerks fell back along the walls. They all wore tight, neat headdresses and formal cotton top shirts, and Hawksworth felt a sudden consciousness of his own clothes, muddy boots, and powder-smeared jerkin and breeches. For the first time since they arrived, he found himself in a room with no other Europeans. The isolation felt sudden and complete. Then he saw the Shahbandar. On a raised dais at the rear of the room, beneath a canopy of gold-embroidered cloth, sat the chief port official of India. He rested stiffly on a four-legged couch strewn with cushions, and he wore a turban of blue silk, narrow patterned trousers, and an embroidered tan robe that crossed to the right over his plump belly, and was secured with a row of what appeared to be rubies. He seemed oblivious to Hawksworth as he cursed and drew on the end of a tube being held to his mouth by an attending clerk. The clerk's other hand worked a burning taper over the open top of a long-necked clay pot. The tube being held to the Shahbandar's mouth was attached to a spout on the side. Suddenly, Hawksworth heard a gurgle from the pot and saw the Shahbandar inhale a mouthful of dark smoke. Tobacco is the only thing the Tapiwalas ever brought to India that she did not already have. Even then, we still had to devise the hookah to smoke it properly. He inhaled appreciatively. It is forbidden during this month of Ramadan, but no man was made to fast during daylight and also forego tobacco. The morning sun still rose in the east, and thus it is written the gate of repentance remains open to God's servants. The Shahbandar examined Hawksworth with curiosity. His face recalled hard desert nomad blood, but now it was softened with ease, plump, and moustachioed. He wore gold earrings, and he was barefoot. "Favor me by coming closer. I must see this Feringhi captain who brings such turmoil to our waters." He turned and cursed the servant as the hookah continued to gurgle inconclusively. Then a roll of smoke burst through the tube, and the Shahbandar's eyes mellowed as he drew it deeply into his lungs. He held the smoke for a moment while he gazed quizzically at Hawksworth, squinting as though the air between them were opaque. "They tell me you are English. May I have the pleasure to know your name?" "I'm Brian Hawksworth, captain of the frigate Discovery. May I also have the privilege of an introduction? I will stand before Allah as Mirza Nuruddin." He again drew deeply on the hookah. "But here I am the Shahbandar." He exhaled a cloud and examined Hawksworth. "Your ship and another were in our bay yesterday. I am told they weighed anchor at nightfall. Do English vessels customarily sail without their captain?" "When they have reason to do so." Hawksworth fixed him squarely, wondering if he was really almost blind or if he merely wanted to appear so. "And what, Captain Hawksworth, brings you and your contentious warships to our port?" "It is not often our friends, the Portuguese, permit their fellow Christians to visit us. Our ships are traders of England's East India Company. Do not squander my time telling me what I already know." The Shahbandar suddenly seemed to erupt. "They have never before come to India. Why are you here now?" Hawksworth sensed suddenly that the Shahbandar had been merely toying with him, that he knew full well why they had come, and had already decided what to do. He recalled the words of Karim, declaring the Shahbandar had his own private system of spies. "We are here for the same reason we have visited the islands, to trade the goods of Europe. But we already do trade with Europeans, the Portuguese, who also protect our seas. Have you found profit in it?" "Enough, but it is not your place to question me, Captain Hawksworth." "Then you may wish to profit through English trade as well. And your merchants, I assume, also expect to profit here. That's the normal basis of trade." Hawksworth shifted, easing his leg. The Shahbandar glanced downward, but without removing his lips from the tube of the hookah. "I notice you have a wound, Captain Hawksworth. Yours would seem a perilous profession." It's sometimes even more perilous for our enemies. I presume you mean the Portuguese. The Shahbandar cursed the servant anew and called for new taper to fire the hookah. But their perils are over. Yours have only begun. Surely you do not expect they will allow you to trade here. Trade here is a matter between England and India. It does not involve the Portugals. The Shahbandar smiled. But we have a trade agreement with the Portuguese, a firman signed by His Majesty, the Moghul of India, allowing them free access to our ports. We have no such agreement with England. Then we were mistaken. We believed the port of Surat belonged to India, not to the Portugals. Hawkesworth felt his palms moisten at the growing game of nerves. India, you would say, has no ports of her own, no authority to trade with whom she will. You come to our door with warfare and insolence, Captain Hawkesworth. Perhaps I would have been surprised if you had done otherwise. The Shahbandar paused to draw thoughtfully on the smoking mouthpiece. Why should I expect this? Although you would not ask, let me assume you have. The reputation of English sea dogs is not unknown in the Indies. And I can easily guess who brought you these libelous reports of England. Perhaps you should examine their motives. We have received guidance in our judgment from those we have trusted for many years. The Shahbandar waved aside the hookah and fixed Hawkesworth with a hard gaze. Hawkesworth returned the unblinking stare for a moment while an idea formed in his mind. I believe it once was written, there are those who purchase error at the price of guidance, so their commerce does not prosper. Neither are they guided. A sudden hush enveloped the room as the Shahbandar examined Hawkesworth with uncharacteristic surprise. For a moment, his eyes seemed lost in concentration. Then they quickly regained their focus. The Holy Quran, Surah Roman 2, if I have not lost the lessons of my youth. He stopped and smiled in disbelief. It's impossible a Topiwala should know the words of the merciful Prophet, on whom be peace. You are a man of curious parts, English captain. Again he paused, and you dissemble with all the guile of a mullah. I merely speak the truth. Then speak the truth to me now, Captain Hawkesworth. Is it not true the English are a notorious nation of pirates? That your merchants live off the commerce of others, pillaging where they see fit? Should I not inquire, therefore, whether you intrude into our waters for the same purpose? England has warred in years past on her rightful enemies, but our wars are over. The East India Company was founded for peaceful trade, and the company is here for no purpose but to trade peacefully with merchants in Surat. Hawkesworth dutifully pressed forward. Our two merchantmen bring a rich store of English goods, woolens, ironwork, lead, while you war with the Portuguese in sight of our very shores. Will you next make war on our own merchants? I'm told it is your historic livelihood. As he studied Hawkesworth, the Shahbandar found himself reflecting on the previous evening. The sun had set, and the Ramadan meal was already underway when Father Manuel Pinheiro, the second-ranked Portuguese Jesuit in India, had appeared at his gates demanding an audience. For 2 tiresome hours, he had endured the Jesuits' pained excuses for Portugal's latest humiliation at sea, and his boasts that the English would never survive a trip upriver. And for the first time Mirza Nuruddin could remember, he had smelled fear. Mirza Nuruddin had sensed no fear in the Portuguese 8 years before, when an English captain named Lancaster had attacked and pillaged a Portuguese galleon in the seas off Java. Then the Viceroy of Goa prayed he would know retribution, although nothing was ever done. And a mere 5 years ago, the Viceroy himself led a fleet of 12 warships to Malacca, boasting to burn the 11 Dutch merchantmen lading there. And the Dutch sank almost his entire fleet. Now the pirates of Malabar daily harassed Indian shipping the length of the western coast, and the Portuguese patrols seemed powerless to control them. In one short decade, he told himself, The Portuguese have shown themselves unable to stop the growing Dutch spice trade in the islands, unable to rid India's coasts of pirates, and now unable to keep other Europeans from India's own doorstep. He studied Hawkesworth again and asked himself why the English had come, and why the 2 small English vessels had challenged 4 armed galleons instead of turning and making for open sea, to trade a cargo of wool. No cargo was worth the risk they had taken. There had to be another reason, and that reason, or whatever lay behind it, terrified the Portuguese. For the first time ever. We defend ourselves when attacked. That's all. Hawkesworth found himself wanting to end the questions, to escape the smoky room and the Shabandar's intense gaze. That has no bearing on our request to trade in this port. I will take your request under advisement. In the meantime, you and your men will be searched and your goods taxed, in keeping with our law. You may search the men if you wish, but I am here as representative of the King of England. And as his representative, I will not allow my personal chest to be searched, no more than His Majesty, King James of England, would submit to such an indignity. Hawkesworth decided to reach for all the authority his ragged appearance would allow. All Feringhi, except ambassadors, must be searched. Do you claim that immunity? I am an ambassador, and I will be traveling to Agra to represent my king. Permission for Feringhi to travel in India must come from the Moghul himself. The Shabandar's face remained impassive, but his mind raced. The stakes of the English game were not wool, he suddenly realized, but India. The English king was challenging Portugal for the trade of India, their audacity as astonishing. A request can be sent to Agra by the governor of this province. Then I must see him to ask that a message be sent to Agra. For now, I demand that my personal effects be released from the customs house, and that no duty be levied on our goods, which are samples and not for sale. If your goods are not taxed, they will remain in the customs house. That is the law. Because you claim to represent your king, I will forego my obligation to search your person. All of your men, however, will be searched down to their boots, and any goods or coin they bring through this port will be taxed according to the prevailing rate, 2.5% of value. Our chief merchant wishes to display his samples to your traders. I have told you, I will consider your request for trade. There are many considerations. He signaled for the hookah to be lighted again. The interview seemed to be ended. Hawkesworth bowed with what formality he could muster and turned toward the counting room door. Captain Hawkesworth, you will not be returning to your men. I have made other arrangements for your lodging. Hawkesworth revolved to see 4 porters waiting by an open door at the Shabandar's left. I must be tired. I hadn't noticed the door until now. Then he realized it had been concealed in the decorations on the wall. When he did not move, the porters surrounded him. No, they're not porters. They're the guards who held back the crowds from the steps, and they're armed now. I think you will find your lodging suitable. The Shabandar watched Hawkesworth's body tense. My men will escort you. Your chest will remain here under my care. The Shabandar returned again to his gurgling hookah. My chest will not be subject to search. If it is to be searched, I will return now to my ship. Hawkesworth still did not move. Your officials will respect my king and his honor. It is in my care. The Shabandar waved Hawkesworth toward the door. He did not look up from his pipe. As Hawkesworth passed into the midday sunshine, he saw the Shabandar's own palanquin waiting by the door. Directly ahead spread the city's teeming horse and cattle bazaar, while on his right, under a dense banyan tree, a dark-eyed beggar sat on a pallet, clothed only in a white loincloth and wearing ashes in his braided hair and curious white and red marks on his forehead. His eyes were burning and intense, and he inspected the new Feringhi. as though he'd just seen the person of the devil. Why should I travel hidden from view? Hawksworth puzzled. But there was no time to ponder an answer. The cloth covering was lifted, and he found himself urged into the cramped conveyance, made even more comfortless and hot by its heavy carpet lining and bolster seat. In moments, the street had disappeared into jolting darkness. The Moghul by Thomas Hoover, Chapter 6. He felt the palanquin drop roughly onto a hard surface, and when the curtains were pulled aside, he looked down to see the stone mosaic of a garden courtyard. They had traveled uphill at least part of the time, with what seemed many unnecessary turns and windings, and now they were hidden from the streets by the high walls of a garden enclosure. Tall, slender palms lined the inside of the garden's white plaster wall, and denser trees shaded a central two-story building, decorated around its entry with raised Arabic lettering in ornate plasterwork. The guards motioned him through the large wooden portico of the house, which he began to suspect might be the residence of a wealthy merchant. After a long hallway, they entered a spacious room with clean white walls and a thick center carpet over a floor of patterned marble inlay. Large pillows lay strewn about the carpet, and the air hung heavy with the stale scent of spice. It's the house of a rich merchant or official, all right. What else can it be? The decorated panels on the doors and the large brass knobs all indicate wealth. But what's the room for? For guests. Number it's too empty. There's almost no furniture. No bed. No. Then suddenly he understood. A banquet room. He realized he had never seen a more sumptuous private dining hall, even among the aristocracy in London. The guards closed the heavy wooden doors, but there was no sound of their footsteps retreating. Who are they protecting me from? A servant with skin the color of ebony and a white turban that seemed to enclose a large part of his braided and folded-up beard, pushed open an interior door to deposit a silver tray. More fried bread and a bowl of curds. Where am I? Whose house? The man bowed, made hand signs pleading incomprehension, and retreated without a word. As Hawksworth started to reach for a piece of the bread, the outer door opened, and one of the guards stepped briskly to the tray and stopped his hand. He said nothing, merely signaled to wait. Moments later, another guard also entered, and with him was a woman. She was unveiled, with dark skin and heavy gold bangles about her ankles. She stared at Hawksworth with frightened eyes. Brisk words passed in an alien language. And then the woman pointed to Hawksworth and raised her voice as she replied to the guard. He said nothing, but simply lifted a long, sheathed knife from his waist and pointed it toward the tray, his gesture signifying all. After a moment's pause, the woman edged forward and gingerly sampled the curds with her fingers, first sniffing and then reluctantly tasting. More words passed, after which the guards bowed to Hawksworth almost imperceptibly and escorted the woman from the room, closing the door. Hawksworth watched in dismay and then turned again to examine the dishes. If they're that worried, food can wait. Who was she? Probably a slave of the Shahbandar. He removed his boots, tossed them in the corner, and eased himself onto the bolsters piled at one end of the central carpet. The wound in his leg had become a dull ache. Jesus help me, I'm tired. What does the Shahbandar really want? Why was Karim so fearful of him? And what's the role of the governor in all this? Will all these requests and permissions and permits end up delaying us so long the Portugals will find our anchorage? And what will the governor want out of me? He tried to focus his mind on the governor, on a figure he sculpted in his imagination. a fat, repugnant, pompous bureaucrat. But the figure slowly began to transform, and in time it became the Turk who had imprisoned him in Tunis, with a braided fez and a jeweled dagger at his waist. The fat Turk was not listening. He was issuing a decree. You will stay. Only then will I have what I want, what I must have. Next, a veiled woman entered the room, and her eyes were like Maggie's. She seized his hand and guided him toward the women's apartments, past the frowning guards, who raised large scimitars in interdiction until she waved them aside. Then she led him to the center of a brilliantly lighted room until they stood before a large stone pillar, a pillar like the one in the porter's lodge, except it was immense, taller than his head. You belong to me now, her eyes seemed to say. And she began to bind him to the pillar with silken cords. He struggled to free himself, but the grasp on his wrists only became stronger. In panic, he struck out and yelled through the haze of incense. I'm only trying to wake you, Captain. A voice cut through the nightmare. His Eminence, the Shahbandar, has requested that I attend your wound. Hawksworth startled awake and was reaching for his sword before he saw the swarthy little man, incongruous in a white swath of a skirt and a Portuguese doublet, nervously shaking his arm. The man pulled back in momentary surprise, then dropped his cloth medicine bag on the floor and began to carefully fold a large red umbrella. Hawksworth noted he wore no shoes on his dusty feet. Allow me to introduce myself. He bowed ceremoniously. My name is Mukherjee. It is my honor to attend the celebrated new Feringhi. His Turkey was halting and strongly accented. He knelt and deftly cut away the wrapping on Hawksworth's leg. And who applied this? With transparent disdain, he began uncoiling the muddy bandage. The Christian Tapiwalas constantly astound me, even though my daughter is married to one. One eyebrow twitched nervously as he worked. Hawksworth stared at him through a groggy haze, marveling at the dexterity of his chestnut-brown hands. Then he glanced nervously at the vials of colored liquid and jars of paste the man was methodically extracting from his cloth bag. It was our ship's physician. He swathed this after attending a dozen men with like wounds or worse. No explanations are necessary. Feringhi methods are always unmistakable. In Goa, where I lived for many years after leaving Bengal, I once served in a hospital built by Christian priests. You worked in a Jesuit hospital. I did indeed. He began to scrape away the oily powder residue from the wound. Hawksworth's leg jerked involuntarily from the flash of pain. Please do not move. Yes, I served there until I could abide it no more. It was a very exclusive hospital. Only Feringhi were allowed to go there to be bled. He began to wash the wound, superficial, but already festering, with a solution from one of the vials. Yes, we Indians were denied that almost certain entry into Christian paradise represented by its portals. But it was usually the first stop for arriving Portuguese, after the brothels. But why do so many Portuguese sicken after they reach Goa? Hawksworth watched Mukherjee begin to knead a paste that smelled strongly of sandalwood spice. It's well that you ask, Captain Hawksworth. Mukherjee tested the consistency of the sandalwood paste with his finger and then placed it aside, apparently to thicken. You appear to be a strong man, but after many months at sea, you may not be as virile as you assume. He absently extracted a large, dark green leaf from the pocket of his doublet and dabbed it in a paste he kept in a crumpled paper. Then he rolled it around the cracked pieces of a small brown nut, popped it into his mouth, and began to chew. Suddenly remembering himself, he stopped and produced another leaf from his pocket. Would you care to try betel, what they call pan here in Surat? It's very healthy for the teeth and the digestion. What is it? A delicious leaf. I find I cannot live without it, so perhaps it's a true addiction. It's slightly bitter by itself, but if you roll it around an areca nut and dip it in a bit of lime, which we make from mollusk shells, it is perfectly exquisite. Hawksworth shook his head in wary dissent, whereupon Mukherjee continued, settling himself on his haunches and sucking contentedly on the rolled leaf as he spoke. You ask why I question your well-being, Captain. Because a large number of the Ferenghis who come to Goa and India are doomed to die. You already said that. From what? Poison in their food. Mukherjee examined him quizzically for a moment as he concentrated on the rolled leaf, savoring the taste, and Hawksworth noticed a red trickle emerge from the corner of his mouth and slide slowly off his chin. He turned and discharged a mouthful of juice into a small brass container, clearing his mouth to speak. The most common illness for Europeans here is called the bloody flux. Mukherjee tested the paste again with his finger, and then began to stir it vigorously with a wooden spatula. For 4 or 5 days, the body burns with intense heat, and then either it is gone or you are dead. Are there no medicines? Hawksworth watched as he began to spread the paste over the wound. Of course, there are medicines. Mukherjee chuckled resignedly, but the Portuguese scorn to use them. Probably wisely, Hawksworth reflected. It said the flux is caused by an excess of humors in the blood. Bleeding is the only real remedy. I see. Mukherjee began to apply the paste, and then to bind Hawksworth's leg with a swath of white cloth. Yes, my friend, that is what the Portuguese do. You must hold still, and I have personally observed how effective it is in terminating illness. The damned Jesuits are the best physicians in Europe. So I have often been told, most frequently at funerals. Mukherjee quickly tied a knot in the binding and spat another mouthful of red juice. Your wound is really nothing more than a scratch, but you would have been dead in a fortnight. By this, if not by exertion. What do you mean? Hawksworth rose and tested his leg, amazed that the pain seemed to have vanished. The greatest scourge of all for newly arrived Europeans. Here seems to be our women. It is inevitable, and my greatest source of amusement. He spat the exhausted betel leaf toward the corner of the room and paused dramatically while he prepared another. Explain what you mean about the women. Let me give you an example from Goa. Mukherjee squatted again. The Portuguese soldiers arriving from Lisbon each year tumble from their ships more dead than alive, weak from months at sea and the inevitable scurvy. They are in need of proper food, but they pay no attention to this, for they are even more starved for the company of women. By the way, how is your wound? Mukherjee made no attempt to suppress a smile at Hawksworth's astonished testing of his leg. The pain seems to be gone. He tried squatted in Indian style, like Mukherjee, and found that this posture, too, brought no discomfort. Well, these scurvy-weakened soldiers immediately avail themselves of Goa's many well-staffed brothels, which, I note, Christians seem to frequent with greater devotion than their fine churches. What uneven test of skill and vigor transpires, I would not speculate. But many of these Ferenghis soon find the only beds suited for them are in the Jesuits' King's Hospital, where few ever leave. I watched some 500 Portuguese a year tread this path of folly. Mukherjee's lips were now the hue of the rose. And what happens to those who do live? They eventually wed one of our women, or one of their own, and embrace the life of sensuality that marks the Portuguese in Goa. With 20, sometimes even 30 slaves to supply their wants and pleasure. And after a time, they develop stones in the kidney or gout, or some other affliction of excess. What do their wives die of? The same thing. Some, yes, but I have also seen many charged with adultery by their fat Portuguese husbands, a suspicion rarely without grounds. For they really have nothing more to do on hot afternoons than chew betel and intrigue with the lusty young soldiers and executed. The women are said to deem it an honorable martyrdom, vowing they die for love. Mukherjee rose and began meticulously replacing the vials in his cloth bag. I may be allowed to visit you again if you wish, but I think there's no need. Only forego the company of our women for a time, my friend. Practice prudence before pleasure. A shaft of light from the hallway cut across the room as the door opened without warning. A guard stood in the passageway, wearing a uniform Hawksworth had not seen before. I must be leaving now. Mukherjee's voice rose to public volume as he nervously scooped up his umbrella and his bag, without pausing to secure the knot at its top. Then he bent toward Hawksworth with a quick whisper. Captain, the Shahbandar has sent his Rajputs. You must take care. He deftly slipped past the guard in the doorway and was gone. Hawksworth examined the Rajputs warily. They wore leather helmets secured with a colored headband, knee-length tunics over heavy, tight-fitting trousers, and a broad cloth belt. A large round leather shield hung at each man's side, suspended from a shoulder strap, and each guard wore an ornate quiver at his waist from which protruded a heavy horn bow and bamboo arrows. All were intent and unsmiling. Their leader, his face framed in a thicket of coarse black hair, stepped through the doorway and addressed Hawksworth in halting Turkey. The Shahbandar has requested your presence at the customs house. I am to inform you he has completed all formalities for admission of your personal chest and has approved it with his chap. The palanquin was nowhere to be seen when they entered the street, but now Hawksworth was surrounded. As they began walking, he noticed the pain in his leg was gone. The street was lined by plaster walls, and the cool evening air bore the scent of flowers from their concealed gardens. The houses behind the walls were partially shielded by tall trees, but he could tell they were several stories high, with flat roofs on which women clustered. Watching, these must all be homes of rich Muslim merchants, palaces for the princes of commerce, and the streets are filled with dark-skinned, slow-walking poor. Probably servants or slaves, in no hurry to end the errand that freed them from their drudgery inside. Then as they started downhill, toward the river, they began to pass tile-roofed, plaster-walled homes he guessed were owned by Hindu merchants, since they were without gardens or the high walls Muslims used to hide their women. As they neared the river, the air started to grow sultry, and they began passing the clay-walled huts of shopkeepers and clerks, roofed in palm leaves with latticework grills for windows. Finally, they reached the bazaar of Surat, its rows of palm trees deserted now, with silence where earlier he had heard a tumult of hawkers and strident women's voices. Next to the bazaar stood the stables, and Hawksworth noticed flocks of small boys, naked save for a loincloth, scavenging to find any dung cakes that had been overlooked by the women who collected fuel. The air was dense and smelled of earth, and its taste overwhelmed his lingering memory of the wind off the sea. The streets of Surat converged like the spokes of a wheel, with the customs house and port as its hub. Just like every port town in the world, Hawksworth smiled to himself. All roads lead to the sea. Except here, all roads lead to the customs house and the Shahbandar. Then, as they approached the last turn in the road, just outside the enclosure of the customs house, they were suddenly confronted by a band of mounted horsemen, armed with long-barreled muskets. The horsemen spanned the roadway and were probably 20 in all, well outnumbering the Rajputs. The horsemen made no effort to move aside as Hawksworth and his guards approached. Hawksworth noticed the Rajputs stiffen slightly, and their hands drop loosely to the horn bows protruding from their quivers. But they did not break their pace. My God, they're not going to halt. There'll be bloodshed, and we're sure to lose. Without warning, A hand threw Hawksworth sprawling against the thick plaster side of a building, and a large, round, rhino-hide buckler suddenly was covering his body, shielding him entirely from the horsemen. Next came a melee of shouts, and he peered out to see the Rajputs encircling him, crouched in a firing pose, each bow aimed on a horseman and taut with its first arrow. The musket-bearing horsemen fumbled with their still uncocked weapons. In lightning moves of only seconds, the Rajputs had seized the advantage. Not only are their bows more accurate than muskets, Hawksworth thought, they're also handier. They can loose half a dozen arrows before a musket can be reprimed. But what was the signal? I saw nothing, heard nothing. Yet they acted as one. I've never before seen such speed, such discipline. Then more shouting. Hawksworth did not recognize the language, but he guessed it might be Urdu, the mixture of imported Persian and native Hindi Karim had said, was used in the Moghul's army as a compromise between the language of its Persian-speaking officers and the Hindi-speaking infantry. The Rajputs did not move as the horseman in the lead withdrew a rolled paper from his waist and contemptuously tossed it onto the ground in front of them. While the others covered him with their bows, the leader of the Rajputs advanced and retrieved the roll from the dust. Hawksworth watched as he unscrolled it and examined in silence. At the bottom, Hawksworth could make out the red mark of a chap, like the one he had seen on bundles in the customs house. The paper was passed among the Rajputs, each studying it in turn, particularly the seal. Then there were more shouts. And finally, resolution. The dark-bearded leader of Hawksworth's guard approached him and bowed. Then he spoke in Turkey, his voice betraying none of the emotion Hawksworth had witnessed moments before. They are guards of the governor, Mukarab Khan. They have shown us orders by the Shahbandar, bearing his seal, instructing that you be transferred to their care. You will go with them. Then he dropped his bow casually into his quiver and led the other men off in the direction of the customs house, all still marching, as though they knew no other pace. Captain Hawksworth, please be tolerant of our Hindu friends. They are single-minded soldiers of fortune and a trifle old-fashioned in their manners. The leader of the guard smiled and pointed to a riderless, saddled horse being held by one of the riders. We have a mount for you. Will you kindly join us? Hawksworth looked at the horse, a spirited Arabian mare, and then at the saddle, a heavy round tapestry embroidered in silver thread with tassels front and back, held by a thick girth also of tapestry. The stirrups were small triangles of iron held by a leather strap attached to a ring at the top of the girth. A second tapestry band around the mare's neck secured the saddle near the mane. The mane itself had been woven with decorations of beads and small feathers. The horse's neck was held in a permanent arch by a leather checkrine extending from the base of the bridle through the chest strap and secured to the lower girth. The mare pranced in anticipation while her coat sparkled in the waning sun. She was a thing of pure beauty. Where are we going? But of course, the governor, Mukarab Khan, has staged a small celebration this afternoon and would be honored if you could join him. Today is the final day of Ramadan, our month-long Muslim fast. He's at the Choghan field, but come, patience is not his most enduring quality. Hawksworth did not move. Why did the Shahbandar change his order? We were going to the customs house to fetch my chest. The governor is a persuasive man. It was his pleasure that you join him this afternoon. But please mount. He is waiting. The man stroked his mustache with a manicured hand as he nodded toward the waiting mount. His Excellency sent one of his finest horses. I think he has a surprise for you. Hawksworth swung himself into the saddle, and immediately his mare tossed her head in anticipation. She was lanky and spirited, nothing like the lumbering mount his father had once taught him to ride at the army's camp outside London so many, many years ago. Without another word, the men wheeled their horses and started off in a direction parallel to the river. Then the one who had spoken abruptly halted the entire party. "Please forgive me, but did I introduce myself? I am the secretary to His Excellency, Mukarrab Khan. We were cast from the civilized comforts of Agra onto this dung-heap port of Surat together. Perhaps it was our stars." Hawksworth was only half listening to the man. He turned and looked back over his shoulder in time to see the Rajputs entering into the compound of the customs house. The leader of the horsemen caught his glance and smiled. "Let me apologize again for our friends of the Rajput Guard. You do understand they have no official standing. They serve whomever they are paid to serve. If that thief, the Shabandar, discharged them tomorrow, and then another hired them to kill him, they would do so without a word. Rajputs are professional mercenaries who do battle as coldly as the tiger hunts game." He turned his horse onto a wide avenue that paralleled the river. The sunlight was now filtered through the haze of evening smoke from cooking fires that was enveloping the city. "Do Rajputs also serve the governor?" The man laughed broadly and smoothed the braided mane of his horse as he twisted sideways in the saddle and repeated Hawksworth's question for the other riders. A peal of amusement cut the quiet of the evening streets. "My dear English captain, he might wish to hang them, but he would never hire them. His Excellency has the pick of the Moghul infantry and cavalry in this district, men of lineage and breeding. Why should he need Hindus?" Hawksworth monitored the riders carefully out of the corner of his eye and thought he detected a trace of nervousness in their mirth. Yes, he told himself, why use Hindus except the Shabandar's Hindu mercenaries got the advantage of you in only seconds, while you and your pick of the Moghul cavalry were fiddling with your uncocked muskets. Perhaps there's a good reason the Shabandar doesn't hire men of lineage and breeding. Hawksworth noticed they were paralleling a wall of the city, a high brick barrier with iron pikes set along its capstone. Abruptly, the wall curved across the road they were traveling, and they were facing a massive wooden gate that spanned the width of the street. Suddenly, guards appeared, each in uniform and holding a pike. They hurriedly swung wide the gate as the procession approached, then snapped crisply to attention along the roadside. "This is the Abidjan Gate." The secretary nodded in response to the salute of the guards. "You can just see the field from here." He pointed ahead, then urged his horse to a gallop. A cooling dampness was invading the evening air, and now the sun had entirely disappeared into the cloud of dense cooking smoke that boiled above the city, layering a dark mantle over the landscape. Again, Hawksworth felt his apprehension rising. What's the purpose of bringing me to a field outside the city, with dark approaching? He instinctively fingered the cool handle of his sword, but its feel did nothing to ease his mind. Then he heard cheers from the field ahead and saw a burning ball fly across the evening sky. Ahead was a large green, and on it horsemen raced back and forth, shouting and cursing in several languages, their horses jostling recklessly. Other mounted horsemen watched from the side of the green and bellowed encouragement. As they approached the edge of the field, Hawksworth saw one of the players capture the burning ball, guiding it along the green with a long stick whose end appeared to be curved. He spurred his mottled gray mount toward two tall posts stationed at one end of the green. Another player was hard in chase, and his horse, a dark stallion, was closing rapidly toward the rolling ball. As the first player swept upward with his stick, lofting the burning ball toward the posts, the second player passed him, and in a maneuver that seemed dazzling to Hawksworth, circled his own stick over his head and captured the ball in midair, deflecting it toward the edge of the green, where Hawksworth and his guards waited. Cheers went up from some of the players and spectators, and the horsemen all dashed for the edge of the green in chase of the ball, which rolled in among Hawksworth's entourage and out of play. The horseman on the dark stallion suddenly noticed Hawksworth, and with a shout to the other players, whipped his steed toward the arriving group. As he approached, Hawksworth studied his face carefully. He was pudgy but still athletic, with a short, well-trimmed mustache and a tightly wound turban secured with a large red stone that looked like a ruby. He carried himself erect, with a confidence only full vigor could impart, yet his face was incongruously debauched, almost ravaged, and his eyes deeply weary. There was no hint of either triumph or pleasure in those eyes, or in his languorous mouth, although he had just executed a sensational block of an almost certain score. He reined his wheezing mount only when directly in front of Hawksworth, sending up a cloud of dust. "Are you the English captain?" The voice was loud, with an impatient tone indicating long years of authority. "I command the frigates of the East India Company." Hawksworth tried to keep his gaze steady. What sort of man can this be, he asked himself. Is this the one who can demand the Shabandar's signature and seal whenever he wishes? Then I welcome you, Captain. The dark stallion reared suddenly, for no apparent reason, in a display of exuberance. The man expertly reined him in, never removing his gaze from Hawksworth, and continued in an even voice. I've been most eager to meet the man who is suddenly so interesting to our Portuguese friends, although I have a personal rule never to dabble in the affairs of Europeans. As a sportsman, I must congratulate you on your victory. A pity I missed the encounter. I accept your congratulations on behalf of the East India Company. Hawksworth watched him for some sign of his attitude toward the Portuguese, but he could detect nothing but smooth diplomacy. Yes, the East India Company. I suppose this company of yours wants something from India, and I can easily imagine it might be profit. Perhaps I should tell you straight away that such matters bore me not a little. The man glanced impatiently back toward the field. But come, it's growing darker as we talk. I'd hoped you might join us in our little game. It's elementary. Should be child's play for man who commands at sea. He turned to one of the men standing by the side of the field. Ahmed, prepare a stick for Captain. By the way, I wasn't given your name. Hawksworth. Yes, prepare a stick for Captain Hawksworth. He'll be joining us. Hawksworth stared at the man, trying to gauge his impulsiveness. You, I presume, are the governor. Forgive me, I so rarely find introductions required. Mukarab Khan, your humble servant. Yes, it's my fate to be governor of Surat, but only because there's no outpost less interesting. But come, we lose precious time. He pivoted his pawing mount about and signaled for a new ball to be ignited. You'll find our game very simple, Captain Hawksworth. The object is to take the ball between the posts you see there, what we call the hal. There are 2 teams of 5 players, but we normally rotate players every 20 minutes. His horse reared again in anticipation as the new ball was brought onto the field. Years ago, we played only during the hours of day, but then our Moghul's father, the great Akman, introduced the burning ball. So he could play at night. It's Paula's wood, very light and slow burning. Hawksworth felt a nudge on his hand and looked down to see a stick being passed upward by one of the attendants. The handle was sheathed in silver, and the stick itself was over 6 feet long, with a flattened curve at the bottom, like a distorted shepherd's crook. Hawksworth lifted it gingerly, testing its weight, and was surprised by its lightness. You will be playing on the team of Abul Hassan. He nodded toward a middle-aged man with a youthful face and no mustache. He is a qazi here in Surat, a judge who interprets and dispenses law, and when he's not busy abusing the powers of his office, he presumes to challenge me at Choghan. The official bowed slightly, but did not smile. His dappled gray mare was sniffing at the governor's stallion. He thinks he has me at a disadvantage, since in Agra we played with only one goal, whereas here they use two. But Choggan is a test of skill, not rules. He leads the White Turbans. Only then did Hawksworth notice that the governor's team all wore red turbans. The governor waved to his attendant. A clean turban for the English captain. I'd prefer to play as I am. Hawksworth saw a flash of disbelief in the governor's eyes. It was obvious he was never contradicted. I never wear a hat, though it seems in India I'm still called a topiwala. Very well, Captain Hawksworth. The topiwala wears no turban. He seemed to smile as he turned to the other players and signaled for play to start. Abul Hassan's team is composed of Surat officials, Captain. You will notice, however, that I am teamed with some of our merchants, Muslim, of course. Not Hindus, something I must do to ensure challenging opponents. The mere presence of merchants here today should give you some idea how very tedious I find living in Surat. In Agra, no merchant would be allowed near a Choggan field. But here, my officials enjoy winning their money so much that I am forced to relent. And he laughed warmly. The burning ball was slammed toward the middle of the field, and the players spurred their horses after it in lunging pursuit. Hawksworth gripped the Choggan stick in his right hand, and the reins in the other as his mount galloped after the others, obviously eager to begin. The red turbans reached the ball first, with the governor in the lead. He caught the ball on a bounce, and wielding his stick in a graceful arc, whipped it under the neck of the dark stallion and directly toward the Hal, while in the same motion reining in his mount sharply to follow its trajectory. But a white turban had anticipated his shot and was already in position to intercept the ball. He cut directly in front of the governor's path, and with a practiced swipe, bulleted the ball back toward the center of the field, knocking a spray of sparks across the face of the governor's horse. Mukarrab Khan's stallion seemed scarcely to notice as he reared, whirled, and flew in chase. The shot had passed over the heads of the three other white turbans and bounced off the grass a few feet behind Hawksworth, still well to the rear. Hawksworth reined his mount about and bore down on the ball, beginning to feel some of the exhilaration of the play. He reached the ball on its second bounce, and with a rigid arc of his arm, swung the Choggan stick. The impact recoiled a dizzying shock through the wood and up his right shoulder. He dimly heard the cheers of his teammates, seeming to congratulate him on his stroke. But where's the ball? He wondered as he scanned the darkened, empty expanse down the field. Then he realized he had only deflected it back toward the three white turbans in the center of the field. The last white turban in the row snared the ball with his stick, deflecting it again, but now in the direction of the Reds. Dust was boiling from the surface of the field, increasingly obscuring the players and the play. The darkened arena had become a jostling mob, friends scarcely distinguishable from foe, and all in pursuit of the only certain object, the still glowing ball. Hawksworth's eyes seared, and his throat choked as he raced after the others always, it seemed, bringing up the rear, while his mount took her head and rarely acknowledged his awkward attempts to command. He clung to the iron ring of his saddle, content merely to stay astride. Give me a quarterdeck any day. The red turbans again had command of the ball, and Hawksworth watched as the governor now raced to the lead, urged on by his teammates. He snared the ball effortlessly, and with a powerful swing, sent it arcing back toward his own Hal. The other red turbans rushed in pursuit, but a white turban was already at the Hal, waiting to deflect the play. He snared the ball in the crook of his stick and flung it back toward the center. The Reds seemed to anticipate this, for they reined as one man and dashed back. But now a white had control, and he guided the ball alone across the grassy expanse, while a phalanx of other whites rode guard. Hawksworth was still lagging in front of his own Hal, when suddenly he saw the ball lofting toward him, a flaming mortar in the darkened sky. It slammed to earth near his horse's flank, spewing sparks. He cut his mare sharply to the left and galloped in pursuit. Above the shouts, he only dimly heard the Reds thundering behind him, closing in as he reached the ball and caught it in the curve of his stick. Roll it, he told himself, keep it on the ground. The Reds were on him. In what seemed a swing for the ball, Abul Hassan brought his stick in a wide arc, its hardened crook accurately intersecting Hawksworth's directly in the middle. Hawksworth felt an uneven shudder pulse through his arm and heard his own stick shatter. The lower half flew to his right, and he watched in dismay as it sailed across the path of Mukarab Khan's mount. Just as the governor cut inward to block Hawksworth, the hard wood caught the dark stallion directly across its front shins, and the horse stumbled awkwardly. Hawksworth stared at horse and rider dumbly for a moment as the stallion lost its stride, and he suddenly realized the governor's horse would fall. And when it did, Mukarab Khan would be thrown directly below the horses thundering behind them. He cut his mount sharply to the right and deliberately slammed into the governor's stallion. Mukarab Khan's dazed eyes flashed understanding, and he stretched for the center ring of Hawksworth's saddle. During the fractional second, their horses were in collision. At the same instant, he disengaged himself from his own stirrups and pulled himself across the neck of Hawksworth's mare. Two alert Reds pulled their mounts alongside Hawksworth and grabbed the reins of his mare. The dark stallion collapsed in the dust behind them with a pitiful neigh. Then it rose and limped painfully toward the edge of the field, its left foreleg dangling shattered and useless. Mukarab Khan lowered himself to the ground with an elaborate oath. A cheer sounded as the whites scored the ball unmolested. Hawksworth was still watching the governor when one of the attendants rushed from the sidelines, seized the silver-topped fragment of his broken stick, and thrust it toward him. "The silver is yours to keep, Sahib. It is the custom that one whose choggan stick is broken in play may keep its silver tip, as a token of bravery. For you it is especially deserved." He was short, swarthy, and dressed in a dust-covered white shirt. He bowed slightly, while his eyes gleamed their admiration in the darkness. "Take it, Captain. It is an honor." Abul Hassan rode up stiffly, brushing the dust from the mane of his horse. "No Feringhi, to my knowledge, has ever before attempted choggan, and certainly none has earned a silver knob. Captain Hawksworth, you rode well." Mukarab Khan had commandeered a mount and also drew alongside. There was a light scratch along the right side of his face, and the whimsical look had vanished from his eyes as he searched the faces clustered around. "A very curious accident. It has never happened before." He stared directly at Hawksworth. "How was your stick broken?" "The Feringhi made an unfortunate swing, Excellency," Abul Hassan interjected. "He played superbly for a beginner, but he has still to fully master the stroke." "Obviously, but he compensated by his luck my luck in saving me from a fall. He rides well enough, no matter how uncertain his stroke." The governor examined them both skeptically. Hawksworth watched the exchange in incredulous silence. The Kazi may be covering for his own accident. Or perhaps it wasn't an accident. And if not, then he tried to kill the Mukarab Khan in a way that would look like it was my responsibility. I still maintain it was most curious. Mukarab Khan turned to watch as the stable keepers prepared to shoot his favorite horse. "But tell me now what you think of choggan, Captain Hawksworth." "It's exhilarating and dangerous. A seaman might say it's like taking the whipstaff all alone in a gale, without a safety line." Hawksworth tried unsuccessfully to decipher Mukarab Khan's thoughts. A quaint analogy, but doubtless apt. He tried to smile. "You know, Captain, there are those who mistakenly regard choggan as merely a game, whereas it is actually much, much more. It's a crucible of courage, It sharpens one's quickness of mind, tests one's powers of decision. The great Ackman believed the same, and for that reason he encouraged it years ago among his officials. Of course it requires horsemanship. But in the last count, it's a flawless test of manhood. You did not entirely disappoint me. I suspect you English could one day be worthy of our little game. A shot rang out, and the governor's face went pale for an instant, his eyes glossed with sadness. Then he turned again to Hawksworth. Deplorable waste. To think I bought him just last year especially for Choggan. From a grasping Arab, a confirmed thief who sensed I fancied that stallion and absolutely refused to bargain. The voice was calmer now, the official facade returning. But enough. Perhaps I could interest you in a drink. He signaled toward the edge of the field, and a waiting groom ran toward them, bearing a black clay pot with a long spout. The sun has set. Ramadan is finished for this year, so I will join you. Let me show you how we drink on horseback. He lifted the pot above his head, tilted the spout toward him, and caught the stream effortlessly in his mouth. Then he passed it to Hawksworth. It's called sharbat. The Topiwallas all seem to like it and mispronounce it sherbet. The water was sugar, sweet and tangy with bits of lemon. God, Hawksworth thought, well, we had barrels of this for the voyage home. As he drank, drenching his beard, he first noticed the icy stars, a splendor of cold fire in an overhead canopy. The town's smoke had been banished by the freshening wind, and a placid silence now mantled the field. The players were preparing to leave, and the grooms were harnessing the remaining horses to lead them home. Tonight we feast to mark the end of Ramadan, Captain, our month of fasting during daylight hours. It's an evening celebrating the return of sensual pleasure. Mukarab Khan stared at Hawksworth for a moment. By the looks of you, I'd suspect you're no Jesuit. I would be honored if you could join me. He forced a blithe cheerfulness his weary eyes belied. As Hawksworth listened, he realized he very much wanted to go, to lose himself for a time. And suddenly, the words of Hyken and of Roger Sims flashed through his mind. Of the India you would not want to leave, until you would not be able to leave. As they rode toward the town, Mukarab Khan fell silent, and Abul Hassan, too, seemed lost in his own thoughts. Hawksworth slowly let his horse draw to the rear in order to count the governor's personal retinue of guards. 30 men, with quivers of arrows beside their saddle, pikes at their right stirrup, and a matchlock musket. As they rode, the other horsemen eyed Hawksworth warily, keeping to themselves and making no effort to talk. Hawksworth thought he sensed an underlying hostility lurking through the crowd, but whether it was between the merchants and officials or toward him, he could not discern. Then a presumptuous thought passed through his mind. Could this entire scene have been staged by Mukarab Khan to somehow test me? But to what purpose? What could he want to find out? Whatever it was, I think he just may have found it. Then he leaned back in the saddle, pushed aside his misgivings, and sampled the perfumed evening air.